Welcome to the Lifestyle First podcast, discussing lifestyle medicine and making self-care as easy as 1, 2, 3. One question, 2 research reviews, and 3 actionable health tips, all centered around the Lifestyle First method, your blueprint for the 10 key routes of optimal health and happiness. And now your host, lifestyle medicine physician and coach, Dr. Alka Patel.
Hi, hey, and hello everyone. Welcome to Series 7, Episode 2. The theme we're focusing on today's podcast is I for identity. And the one question that we're exploring is there a real you? Now, to help us answer that question, I am delighted to welcome my guest today, who is Dr. Julian Baggini. Julian is a philosopher, he's a TEDx speaker, and he's also the author, co-author, or editor of over 20 books. And they include titles which include How the World Thinks, The Virtues of the Table, The Ego Trick, and most recently, The Great Guide. Now, Julian was also the founding editor of the Philosophers magazine, and he's written for many, many, many newspapers and magazines. He's also academic director of the Royal Institute of Philosophy and an honorary research fellow at the University of Kent. Julian, welcome, welcome. It is my absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you today.
Well, thank you for having me, Alka.
No, you're very, very welcome. Now, Julian, to start this conversation off and get us thinking about that question, is there a real you? I've just been thinking about one of the common reasons people come and see me. And one thing that keeps coming up is that people seem to hit a time in their life when they feel lost. They don't know which direction to travel in. They've got all these roles and titles: mother, husband, manager, CEO, lawyer, plumber, friend, colleague, you name it, the list goes on. But despite all these roles, I tend to see people who've lost that sense of identity, who can't really answer the question, who am I? So can we just kick off with the question then, before we go into what that all means, does it actually matter? Why do you think identity even matters?
It's a very good question. And it does seem to be something quite fundamental. I don't know whether it's something which matters more in the kind of society we live in. I'm thinking more traditional societies, the question of your identity wouldn't really arise. It would always be very clear what it was. So for various reasons, I've been reading about traditional Maasai society at the moment, for example. And in that kind of society, you know, at various stages in life, you have a certain role. And as a young man, you go through the warrior stage, and certain things are very, very clearly expected of you. And so I doubt very much that people have any sort of crises of identity there, because nothing's chosen, nothing's given. One of the things that our society does is it breaks apart all those traditional assumptions. It gives us a feeling that, you know, there's no absolute necessity about what we need to be. There's an element of choice, and we can be more than one thing as well. So by opening up all those possibilities, it also creates perhaps a certain anxiety and uncertainty. You know, have we chosen the right paths? Are we the right things, and so forth? So, and I think, why does it matter? I don't know, but I think because there seems to be a sense in which, you know, knowing who you are, what you stand for, I think it's a lot to do with values, actually. Hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that. Knowing what your values are is very important to having, you know, it's what helps us to navigate the world, you know. So I think it is important, and I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to put our fingers on these things because they're so shifting, they're so variable, and they're a matter of choice in a way they didn't used to be.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up values, because they are those things, aren't they? Those sort of that compass, that needle that we use to sort of identify what we stand for, why we wake up in the morning, what the purpose of our day might be in terms of how you want to show up in the world today. But we hear so many terms, don't we? People are always saying, be authentic, or be yourself, or just be you. And again, I come across a lot of my patients who talk about imposter syndrome, so they're meant to be something else, and they aren't. So what do you say to that? Are you really an imposter in your own skin?
Well, imposter syndrome is very common. I think I have it to a certain extent myself. In my case, it comes from having a family background where, no one had, no, and to be honest, none of my parents' generation even stayed on at school beyond the minimum age, and no one of my generation had gone to university. And you find yourself in a world surrounded by people who have been very educated from a young age, and often therefore have a sort of cultural depth of cultural references that you don't have because, you didn't grow up with all these things. So I kind of get that too. But in terms of the values, I think it's so much more useful. I think, authentic, real you, I kind of sense what people are getting at there. But I think, I mean, you have more expertise on this than me. But if someone sort of says to me, they're not sure, they're not feeling authentic, for example, then I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but often what that really means is that there's somehow a disconnection between what they're doing day in, day out and what they truly value, right? So it's like, so it doesn't feel authentic, for example, to be going in a job which involves sales for a product you don't believe in, right? Because there's a clash. Whereas if this is nothing to do with whether a job is high status, low status, high paid, low paid. If you love coffee and you're working in a coffee shop, and maybe it's your own coffee shop and you're earning very little money, you're doing something that aligns with your values. You think great coffee is great and you want people to share it. Whereas, if you're running a big company and what the company is doing just doesn't align with your values, that's not going to feel right. So I sometimes think that authenticity it's not about there being it's not about finding the real you, if you like. It's about identifying what your real values are. And that's an interesting process as well, because I think it's not about simply discovery either. Our values change. We find things out about the world, and that makes our values kind of move on. They're not static things either. And I think for me, that's one of the key things that I think is unhelpful about common ways of speaking, such as to find your true self, find your authentic self, is it often sounds as though that thing is just already there waiting to be discovered. And once you've connected with it, bingo, you're off. You just live your life. Whereas actually, living authentically in the true sense, I'd say, according to your values, is a process, because as we age, as we learn, our values change and we change. It's much, much more dynamic than just finding that true self and running with it.
Yeah, and you allude to that in your book, don't you? I think it's the ego trick, where you talk about how difficult it is to identify and even recall yourself in your childhood, making the decisions as the person that you are now. And so much of us is meant to stay the same because it's part of our identity, and yet so much of us changes. So that idea of almost evolution in action is probably how I like to describe it, is that's what we are. We are evolution in action. We're creating our true selves by our actions.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, so one of the phrases I use in the book is something like, the I is a verb disguised as a noun. And that relates to what you're saying about how we create things by our actions. It's what we do and how we live which really makes us who we are. And that is an ongoing process. So you get this sort of rather strange situation. If you try and remember yourself in the past, there's often many ways in which you entirely recognize that it is you, and other ways that seem totally bizarre. And it may not even be distant past, to be honest. Sometimes people go through a difficult period in their lives. Perhaps they're very stressed. And like a few months later, they look back and they scratch their heads and think, what was I doing? What was I thinking? And the temptation they say that wasn't me. And what we really mean there is, well, no, it was you, unfortunately, sometimes. But it was an aspect of you that sort of came more to the fore than you would normally like it to do because of those situations. And hopefully now you've put back in its place. And I do think that idea that, we are obviously highly multifaceted. And to a certain extent, we're always kind of, to a certain extent, putting things in the background and the foreground, depending on context. So, I don't imagine you're exactly the same with me as you are with your children, or with the father of your children, with your parents. And that's not because you're a kind of someone who's always dissembling. That's not true. It's all these are authentic, real parts of you. And it's quite appropriate. In fact, I would suggest that someone who's exactly the same with everybody they knew would be someone who's lacking certain social skills and sort of lacking a certain awareness of what's required in other situations. So it is dynamic, it is changing. And that creates opportunities for us to kind of try and push things in a direction that we would like to go. Change is always a possibility. But the delicate thing here is that we're not completely malleable. There's limits to how malleable we can be. And I think that, again, one of those things, when people say to children, I think they think encouragingly, you can be whatever you want to be. There's a way in which that simply isn't true. And it's kind of almost harmful to tell them that, right? It's literally not true. I mean, in terms of it's most obvious in things like sport, in elite sport, unless you've got the innate capabilities at the beginning, you're never going to reach the top, no matter how hard you try. So telling someone you can be anything you want to be just isn't helpful. But at the same time, the opposite trap is even worse, telling people they can't be anything other than what they already are. So I think it's a tricky thing to navigate this middle path between believing our nature and essence to be so fixed that we can't change it, and having the fantasy that we can change it however we want. There are limits that way too.
But I guess then from what you're saying, there is something still about discovery, isn't there? Because until you put yourself in a position of stretch and trying new things and doing things that you think might not be possible, how else will you discover what is innate within you to showcase, to show up as, to become part of your value system? What would you say to that? Because I think that's where people also get stuck as well, is in that discovery place. Are there useful ways to discover you?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, but again, I think I have to be a little bit careful about that, because you are right that often we don't know our full range of capabilities. And one of the great things about trying to stretch ourselves, and use that term, and to put ourselves in unfamiliar situations, is we can discover we have capacities we didn't know we had. But even that is not necessarily a straightforward matter of discovery. Sometimes, by pushing ourselves in certain directions, it's not that we're discovering something that was already there. We've actually developed ourselves in such a way that we've developed a new capacity, or perhaps a new interest and a new passion. So as long as we don't sort of assume that it was always lying in wait, only waiting to be found, then I think there's something in that. I mean, I like to think of a neat little example, but it's hard to do. But for example, let's say somebody discovers that they are, I don't know, perhaps more adventurous than they thought they were. It doesn't mean that had they tried to be that adventurous 10 years ago, they would have had the same result. Sometimes it's the case that at a particular stage in your life, you really, what you need most and what you feel you need most is a kind of stability, and you don't want to rock the boat, and you wouldn't do that. 10 years later, your situation is a bit different. You put yourself in a situation where you're not entirely comfortable with the change, but nevertheless, there's something pushing you in that direction. You discover that, yes, now I want to take that risk and have that adventure, whatever it might be. So, things are always changing in our background, and our inherent capabilities are changing as well. They're not just all there, given to us at birth and never changing. And that's why I think the development and growth thing is really important, because, in a sense, the more you push yourself down the road of developing and pushing yourself, you do open up possibilities that would not have been open to you before. So you're expanding your horizons in that kind of way.
Because you do, don't you? Ultimately become the collection of your experiences and your beliefs as well. So you need to have those experiences to know who you become. You've got a great analogy in your TEDx talk, Julian, which I'd love you to go through that analogy when you talk about the watch and the sum of its parts, because I think that's a really helpful way to just really get back to answering that question. Is there a real you?
Yeah, well, the basic idea, I mean, the core idea, the philosophical idea, which is, it's not original. It's not my idea. It goes back to, you can find versions of it in Buddhist thought, and certainly you get it in David Hume in the Western tradition in the 18th century. But it seems that, a lot of people do have an assumption that whatever I am, it is something kind of singular And like, it may be an immaterial soul, maybe it's something which is like singular, it's a thing, it pops into existence at your birth and it extinguishes itself at death, or if you believe in an afterlife, pops into another life. This is this sort of indivisible core essence of being. And the kind of view that I'm defending is the one that says that's not true, actually, that all we are, in a sense, is the collection of our experiences, our memories, our thoughts. And these are all embodied as well. This is not downplaying the importance of the body, but these things are essentially to do with how we think and feel and so forth. So now, when people aren't familiar with that idea, and you say you're just like the sum of your parts, as it were, people think that's a bit disturbing because they like to believe there is something at the core of this which is stable and permanent and enduring. And the point about comparing it to the watch is just think of anything, think of everything. Look around your room, look out the garden. Everything that you see is a collection of parts. And we don't have any problems with that. We don't think things are illusions as a result of that. So the fact that the watch simply is the mechanism, the face, the strap, the hands, all these things put together, no one goes, wow, you mean to say there's not really a watch after all? There's only the parts of the watch? We go, well, no, obviously the watch is all the parts put together operating properly, just in the same way as water is H2O. You learn that very early in school. You don't think, my God, water doesn't exist. It's only H2O. But when it applies to ourselves, people sometimes do find that worrying. They do find it odd to think that they, like everything else in the universe, is simply the sum of its parts. And I think it can sometimes take a little bit of time just to recognize the fact that that's not just okay, it's the only way things could be. What else could we possibly be? What would it mean to have a kind of this indivisible essence?
Yeah, and I spent a lot of time after listening to that on your talk, really pondering that and thinking about that. And I think you're right, you just need to let that concept seep in a little bit, don't you? And then actually, in a way, sort of be able to celebrate that in a way that there doesn't need to be this central core that you're constantly needing to discover, but that you're going to become that simply by allowing yourself to have experiences in a way that show up your value and your beliefs and what's important to you. So yeah.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, a lot of people historically have seen this view as ultimately being quite a liberatory one. So I think in the Buddhist tradition, part of accepting this enables us to kind of escape that kind of, fear and craving we have for eternal existence. Once you kind of recognize the fact that, you are just this ever-changing collection of parts, then you can be more relaxed about the fact that, over time, this thing will change and perhaps will cease to exist completely in the future. Derek Parfit was a 20th century British philosopher who had a view like this, and he very much saw it like that. Because, if you think of your existence as something that is all or nothing, you pop into the earth at birth and then death is the end, or, you can give yourself the afterlife as a get out if you like. But if you can't believe in that, it could be quite terrifying. But once you sort of get used to the idea that, everything is impermanent, everything is in change, including ourselves, then I think one can be a little bit more relaxed with the idea that, nothing is forever, including ourselves, and that we're changing. So it becomes impossible. I, at this moment, could not ever live forever, because whatever is kind of like this body and this mind becomes in 20, 30 years' time, if I was to be lucky to live that long, would already be quite different from me. It wouldn't be exactly me. It would already be changing. So it's becoming more relaxed about that idea of change and impermanence, And I do think there's probably a good reason why, a lot of wisdom traditions and philosophies in different parts of the world have one way or another come back to that key message about impermanence and flux as being an important thing to come to terms with.
So based on that then, do you think we're any closer to understanding what identity is? I know a book that you've referenced previously, Raymond Martin and The Rise and Fall of the Soul and the Self, they trace the development of theories of self all the way back, as you've sort of alluded to, Buddhist times, ancient Greeks, all the way to the present day. We've been talking about identity for a very, very long time. Yeah. Are we just going to keep going full circle, do you think?
Well, yeah, in a sense, everyone has to discover it for themselves, and every generation has to rediscover it for themselves. And I think sometimes with these big philosophical issues, there's an easy bit and there's a hard bit. In a sense, the easy bit is the theoretical bit, right? So in a way, it's not difficult, I think, to explain in philosophical terms what it is to be a person and what it is to have an identity. But at a personal level, what's difficult, and partly because it's ever-changing, is getting a real grip on what that means for us at this time. And, and it's a slippery thing because, you may actually be at a stage of your life where you're very comfortable with your identity. You think you know what you stand for. You think you know who you are. And that's great. But because we just naturally change, that's no guarantee that in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 15 years' time, it isn't going to become problematic again. Because, in different life stages, we change. What we feel is most important to ourselves at age 25, for example, it would be a bit strange if that was still identical at the age of 45. So on an individual level, it's a constant kind of challenge and it's a constantly shifting thing and it's difficult to keep working at it. But to understand philosophically what's underpinning it actually isn't so difficult.
Yeah. So then what are your views on self-discovery then? Do you think mindfulness, meditation, or simply giving yourself some space and time for introspection, even sort of, you've alluded to previously as well, things like personality tests and discovering your character traits, are these all useful ways to discover you, or should we just let that go?
Some more than others. I mean, I do think things like, meditation, introspection, self-reflection are important and they can be useful. But also, actually, sometimes even more useful is just listening and getting the honest advice of people who know you best. Sometimes it's other people who see ourselves clearer than we do. In terms of things like personality tests and so forth, the reason I'm a bit skeptical about those is I think they're very, very limited value because the temptation with them is almost invariably to do them and to see the result as saying something kind of definitive. Whereas actually, all these character traits are so much more complex and they do depend on circumstances. In fact, recently I've always come to the view that one of the big problems we have is consistently not recognizing just how context dependent things are. So let's take, for example, the introvert extrovert distinction, which is, one of the less controversial distinctions in personality psychology. And that's not a difference between, we understand it's not about whether you're shy or not. It's whether or not essentially, the way I hear it put, which makes sense to me, is are you more energized by contact with other people? And do you find yourself really craving that if you're away from it? Or do you kind of need time by yourself to recharge? Is that where you kind of get your energy from? And although I can see there's some value in that distinction, it can also be rather misleading because I think most people, I think I'm primarily an introvert, but that doesn't mean that I don't often get energy from other people. I have extrovert aspects of myself as well. And it very much might depend a bit on what the situation is, what's been going on recently, et cetera, et cetera. So the worry I have with personality tests and Myers-Briggs tests and everything is they encourage us to think that any of these things that's identified is more fixed and one-dimensional than it really is. So I think to use them correctly, you've got to kind of see them as providing, insights into aspects of yourself rather than nailing down what yourself is. But of course, the very reason people like them so much is it can be very reassuring to think you're nailed down. People like, I am an INTJ. That's what I am. I know now. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, that's Ben Goldacre, the science writer, used to sell T-shirts on his website saying, I think you'll find it's more complicated than that, which was the answer to almost every scientific question. It's the answer to questions of philosophy and identity too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, no, love that. I think that basically it's all about enabling yourself to change and allowing that rather than boxing yourself into these character traits that you come up with.
And now, here is your lifestyle first prescription. Your 3 activating actions to take you from knowing to doing.
I'd love it if you could leave us with just a few musings, perhaps some questions or exercises that listeners could do to just start to get to that place of thinking about is there a real you? What can we do?
Yeah. Okay. Well, what are a few things you can do? Well, I mean, one thing I think that's worth doing is to do what David Hume suggested doing, which was to actually sit down at one point in a chair, sort of try and observe yourself, try and sort of find out, observe yourself thinking. Try and do that and see what you find. And actually, what he suggested you'd find is that you really wouldn't end up with discovering a kind of any kind of self. You would notice that you had a thought, a feeling, a sensation, and that's kind of a bit freaky at times. But it's also a real way of making evident to yourself that that you are just a collection of these things. I mean, certain forms of meditation in the Buddhist tradition do the same kind of thing. They're about trying to sort of get into that state where you simply observe your thoughts and feelings as they arise. And there are various different functions of that. But one is to simply become aware of the fact that this is what your inner life is like. It's about an arising, and it's not about there being some permanent self. So these kind of little exercises to become more aware of what's going on can be useful. The other thing I think is to do a sort of a negative version of that personality test. Jot down on a piece of paper what you think your main character and personality traits are, the ones that come to mind, and then go and look at it again and ask yourself, well, is that always true of me? Is that completely true of me? Just a nice way of challenging preconceptions you might have of yourself. I think that's quite useful as well. And then also to do a similar exercise, perhaps with other people, I'll ask people, in different contexts, it'd be interesting to say to them, what do you think? What do you think, are my key character traits? And be honest. And say to them, you must list at least one negative one as well. People are very reluctant to do that. I think we live in a culture where we very much want to big each other up and big ourselves up, which has some good aspects to it. But I do kind of think that unless we're prepared to kind of be honest about our failings and where we fall short, we can't really develop. So, it's becoming, but all these three things together, I think, are ways in which we just become a little bit more self-scrutinizing, a little bit more self-aware. And by simple things, not by doing any kind of like elaborate online test or, going away for a 7-day retreat and sort of taking ayahuasca or anything.
Oh, no, I love that. It's very much about having an honest conversation with yourself, isn't it? And that's what discovery is, giving yourself space to have that and being really open with yourself. And I love that noticing exercise. I do that sort of quite a lot with my patients as well, and actually can be quite fun. Like, you've got to get really curious about yourself. And once you become that observing self and think about where your mind actually is. I often talk about it as almost sort of watching a stage show of your thoughts just playing out in your sort of in the audience, and you're choosing where your sort of attention is going. Just like when we go to the theatre and we watch a dance troupe, we're always focusing on one or two people or one or two things happening on the stage. So again, it's really interesting to know what are you following in your mind, what thoughts and feelings are you actually able to observe. So I love that curious discovery and challenging yourself as well in terms of again what I call flavor and savor. So yes, you've got your values and you're trying to flavor your day with them, but actually, are they really showing up? Are you able to savor on the things that you think you're showing up as, and again being honest about that. So I think there's a three incredibly useful exercises actually, and I don't think people give themselves time to do those, but there's a lot of revelation in that, isn't there?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much, Julian. This has really been a very thought-provoking conversation for sure. It's possibly left us with more questions to answer than answers, which is the best way, I think. But really appreciate you sharing your insights with us today. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, Aku. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Very welcome. So, look, I'm going to draw the episode to a close and simply wish everyone listening a happy, healthy day.
Thanks for joining us on the Lifestyle First podcast, making self-care as easy as 1, 2, 3. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and we'd love it if you'd be kind enough to leave a review. To learn more or to arrange a consultation, please visit www.dralkapatel.com. See you next time.